Hello and welcome to the Startups of London podcast. I'm your host Ozan and the founder of Startups of London. Today I'm joined by Samreen McGregor, who is an executive advisor and coach to senior leaders. We have a lot of interesting things to talk about with the UK, the cultures, the coaching markets, how culture grows in startups, trauma's effect on leaders, identity, and a lot of fascinating conversations. So I'm looking forward to it already. Welcome, Samreen.
Thank you.
Let's start with the difficult questions. Trauma, when we talk about that concept, it seems like a very distant psychological concept that should perhaps on the surface not really be about business. It is perhaps for some people difficult to make the connection between trauma and business and startup growth and so on. But I feel like there's a faint thread that turns out to be very important. And I would like to get your thoughts on that as we start. How does the previous personal history of founders affect the cultures of the companies they are building, for the better or for the worse?
Wow, what a fantastic. And to start there.
Yeah. Sorry about that, putting you on the spot, but I think we have to get the most difficult and the most important thing at the top of the conversation, just to frame our conversation.
Well, actually, I'm just going to tell a tiny story about that before I answer it specifically. I've recently written a book, and in the book, I explore this topic, and I explore it with, especially during my research and, preparing to write about it, but also to frame it within the context of my professional expertise. I'd actually talked about the subject in the 4th chapter of the book. And I had it looked at by a colleague of mine who, his name is John Higgins. He's a researcher and he's written many books. And he read the book. He was one of the first people to read it. He said, Samreen, you need to put it right at the front. You need to put it right at the start. You can't make people wait for this, because this really does position the whole purpose of this book. So I want to share that because I think trauma is something that people maybe fear. That's a generalization, the way I even said that, and I'm talking about it as if it's something not, relating to me. But, the word trauma is evocative, but we're living in a world where the backdrop is, it's relentless, and it's inevitable that we live through adversities and things that challenge us. And the whole statistic around PTSD and anxiety and stress, and some of, actually, to just extrapolate a little bit, the long-term effects of the stress that we live day to day are actually looking more and more worrying. And therefore, for me, inquiring into it and just understanding it, or perhaps not putting our fear to the side, but putting our fear it's sort of in brackets for a minute, just to understand with a calm mind what this means, is really quite critical for leaders. Now, you asked me specifically about leaders of startups or entrepreneurs, those who make a choice to take risks, to be profitable, or to scale something that is in line with a personal purpose. So the learnings that come from adversity and the learnings that come from the discomfort that we face when we live with trauma are invaluable, absolutely invaluable, because it's through those learnings and through some of the emotional challenges that come with that journey that are hugely rich. And they might not feel great, but they're definitely very insightful.
We were talking about Gabor Mate and just before the podcast for our listeners out there. And it turns out both Samreen and I are taking a look at the same things, as kind of like a very cute coincidence. And yes, I've been reading Gabor Mate's book, The Myth of Normal. And in that, there are a few things that stuck with me, but one of them is the differentiation of trauma with the capital T and then trauma with lowercase t. So the capital T one is the type of trauma that we understand when we use the word, something big, drastic, uncommon, terrible type of a situation has occurred and it has scarred the person. But then there is the other type of trauma, which is just being exposed to systematic situations throughout our life. For example, I feel like we have to tie this, make the connection between the very psychological concept and leadership and startup and growth, make that connection really tightly, because sometimes it's not understood as well. But what happens is someone who is in business life, for example, meets leaders who are not honest to them, or feels kind of screwed over over a deal. Sometimes they feel like they are let go of a company unfairly. They're not getting paid unfairly. And these are all micro traumas, like the trauma with the lowercase t. And as a result of that, people show a certain adaptation. And that adaptation, as I see it, is becoming more okay with being dishonest to the people that you work with, and so on and so forth. And that really does shape how the companies operate. You give a feedback to the CEO, and then you get yelled back. And then you don't give it for a second time. And what happens then? The company culture is not a transparent culture anymore. Can you reflect on these topics, Samreen, before we carry on?
Absolutely. I think you raise something that's a phenomena in any social context, but in a business, corporate, startup context, it will be very frequent that we see individuals acting upon their experience of a past that subconsciously influences and colors their present. And without being conscious or understanding or being able to identify the connection between something that may have happened in the past to make sense of how they're behaving in the current, it is unlikely that some of those adaptations will stop happening. So a great example is if someone has had very frequent feedback from a particular stakeholder, boss, or partner within a business context, and that person has been perpetuating a pattern that may have been established in their childhood because a parent was far more critical than was helpful for that person to grow into a more confident and assertive state, that pattern will continue to show itself in his or her relationships in the current. So a stakeholder might make expectations and that person will just say yes and subordinate. Or a partner might even behave in certain ways that it undermine the level of trust that they share. But because it's not questioned, it's being influenced by the subordinate behaviors from the past. And that's just it's a costly way for our relationships to evolve in the current future.
This does make me think of this physics analogy almost. They say 98% of the total matter is dark matter, right? We don't see it, we don't interact with it. Just like that, it makes me think, in actuality, perhaps, let's say, at least 50% of how people behave in relation to the people they work with is shaped by their corresponding past experiences, past trauma, both with capital T and a lowercase t. But we never talk about that. And it is never part of the conversation. It's never part of the discourse. Isn't that very weird?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, one of the things I've been trying to encourage people to notice and be more mindful of is, what is the unseen? What are the things that we don't talk about? What are the conversations we don't have? And actually, often it's because we're so task focused. We live in a world where our customers' wants, our needs, their expectations are highly demanding and at speed. You've got these challenger organizations, these startups, actually, all of us are part of them, breaking through established industries that have worked really well in the past. And in the post-industrial revolution, would have been far more certain and far more predictable. So now these challenges are creating a room that requires us to respond very, very quickly. And this landscape requires us to move fast, to focus on the task, and to get things done. So stopping just to go, hang on a second, just while we're having this conversation, can we just give ourselves a space to understand something that lies beneath that neither of us are noticing and perhaps is either unconscious or we just haven't got the time to address? Do
you think we need more of coaches and advisors, and what is the role they can play in all of these? And how does this topic tie to your book, Leader Awakened?
Well, of course, the obvious answer is going to be yes, given that I've been over the last 11 years now running an organization that, puts at the heart of business, creating that space and time to slow down, to think, to reflect, to also notice what our bodies tell us, because often in that rhythm of life that I just described, we don't have access to some of the really important signals that our bodies can give us. So yes, of course, coaches, mentors, people who are skilled at enabling individuals and teams, I would say, to just slow down. I actually introduce a top leadership development concept in the book called refraction, going back to your physics analogy, which is, if you look in the mirror, Yeah, you're reflecting and it's bouncing, the light is bouncing off a
Yeah.
smooth surface. But when something refracts and it goes from one medium to another, it needs to change speed. And if it changes speed and it goes faster, it goes towards the norm. But if it changes speed and it goes slower, it actually goes away from the norm. So it encourages us to do something different. And that concept is absolutely what I think coaches and mentors enable people to do. There is a difference between some of the skills I would classify as skills that coaches would use and what mentors would use. But I think actually, on the whole, both of those types of resources should be able to work across that skill set. But some skills are about advocating, about guiding, about providing direction and insight and building intuition by telling you, this is what I did, or this is how things work out there, informing, providing more prescriptions. Whereas on the other hand, you've got more of the coaching skills, which are far more catalytic. They're Socratic, and they stimulate shifts in mindset, but also shifts in a sense of lived behavior and experience.
Indeed. This is truly a fascinating area of conversation. I think we definitely have a lack of people who bring in a deep level understanding of human behavior and psychology into the workplace to increase the effectiveness and efficiency of organizations, to increase their problem solving skills, and honestly make them happier places to work, because it's just a big part of our life. One example that I have ties back to an interesting conversation, is again about perhaps trauma and how it shapes us, but I think it goes beyond that, which is this new concept that I've learned called parts. I don't know if have you heard of this, the concept of parts. Yeah. And it's actually that simple. It's just, it ties into some concepts of schema therapy as well. But the basic idea is not only people that are diagnosed with schizoid personality disorders have parts, but having parts is a natural and healthy way of living for most of them. And what is meant by this is, I have a part, for example, which is more attuned when I'm out and social. I have a different part that is on the reins, perhaps at home relaxing. And I have a different part when I'm trying to get a task done, etc., etc. So what I'm trying to say is, organizations set certain standards and it kind of activates a certain part in all of these people. And the part that has activated may be hostile. It might activate the part that is defensive in people, not the most problem-solving part. So as a result of that, the organizations cap their capacity. But the sad thing is they will never be aware why their capacity is capped. And what makes me also sadder, and I would like to get your thoughts on this, and I think that kind of is a segue to understanding some of the demand dynamics in the coaching market in general. As someone who's spent way too much time on human psychology, I actually feel, okay, these are areas of growth and huge value, huge financial bottom line value can be created for companies. But when I have conversations with founders, I feel they see this as an afterthought, not a priority, and an ineffectual intervention in most cases. What is your experience with this? Do you think the demand for consultancy, coaching, executive leadership is on the increase?
Wow. A couple of things. Number one, I just want to very, very briefly respond to your point around parts.
Please.
Totally resonates. And yes, from a psychological perspective, and perhaps different language that I've learned is more about personas and how, whatever context we're in, those personas are activated and, might stimulate projections or transference depending on our experience from the past, how our personas evolve in the moment and in the present, and then how the culture around us or the social context around us, connects with those various different personas. So completely recognize that. In terms of the market for coaching, and I am going to talk a little bit about the numbers, it's really, really surprising. It's the coaching market. And I'm not saying executive, I'm not saying life, I'm not saying health. There's a variety of different segments in the market, but it's been valued at $20 billion globally in 2020, end of 2020, with a revenue of 2.9 billion. This is mainly one-on-one in any of those across those categories. I'll break this down in a minute. So, the current understanding, and I'll come back to the afterthought point that you're making, but, currently the evidence is showing that 99% of individuals within companies that are receiving coaching, and this is in a corporate context, are actually either satisfied or very satisfied with the results of receiving coaching. I would probably hazard a guess that that's in a business coaching context, which, would span across various contexts for professionals. Now, 96% are claiming that they would do it again, as in have another coach, because the impact was in that moment, and clearly that there was potential for continued growth and development and impact on their ability to perform within their context. Now, 93,000 coaching professionals are working globally, according to a number of different, this one came from the ICF, International Coaching Federation. There's a number of different statistics that I've picked up from various places. And online coaching platforms are currently valued at $2 billion. So they're projected to grow and double, I think, over the next 5 years. More than double, actually. And then there's an educational segment to this, which is in universities. And this is one of my interests, because in order for me to really build scale to the work that I do, I can't grow the number of leaders I work with or the number of teams I work with just in one of them. And so, collaborating with universities and organizations is really, really important. But the projected growth of coaching through the educational sector, 12%. Now, just a couple of other things. So in executive coaching, the Future Market Insights has reported a $9.3 billion segment, size of the market. A 1 billion increase in 2022, which I thought was extremely striking last year when I read about this.
It is.
And it's fascinating, and I'm thinking, so there's, and let's just go to return on investment. So 30% of Fortune 500 companies are using coaching regularly for their senior leaders. And for every $1 invested, there is $7.9 return on investment calculated. And the Institute of Coaching reports a 600% ROI. So there are some pretty now, don't ask me to validate any of this data, but it is out there. And there is the one thing it does demonstrate to me is there's interest in understanding and evidencing the impact and the value of coaching.
100%. At least we are heading in a good direction. That's what I gather from the data that you've collected and shared with us as well. It is perhaps distributed unevenly into some sectors and so on. In larger organizations, with them having more resources and so on, and more parties, more stakeholders, I think there's a better understanding of the role of leadership coaching. And it is being embraced more and more, I would say. I would concur with that. In the world of the startups, scale-ups, because they are usually younger founders as well, and the companies themselves are younger, there's like an inherent focus on solving technological problems and the sorts. It just is not at the level that I hope it should be. And I think there's a lot of value that can be gained. But I think we are heading in that direction slowly but surely. Hopefully we can accelerate that just a bit. Do you think that's going to happen?
Yes. And one thing, just in response to your point about the younger generation and those who make up more of what I would say are leaders, inspiring, growing communities in the ecosystem. 67% Gen X leaders want coaching and recognize the need. What's fascinating in my experience of working with, I worked in a large corporate that set up a digital organization, the equivalent of an incubator, during a fairly significant joint venture. And I was an advisor and a coach to one of the much younger, really, really fascinating people who'd come in from various tech companies, established tech companies, but also, new and coming, very interesting organizations in the tech world. And I noticed that the connection that a lot of these people that I worked with, they shared with their peers was far more about a shared product or service that they wanted to create. So hugely passionate, but less connection with one another. It was really, really interesting observation. And I noticed it over time. And the relational experience was far more about something out there that we're working on together rather than us as peers. And I do feel that there's no surprise there. They've grown up. A lot of these younger people have grown up in a highly technological world where we do connect you with the barrier of an object, which is a technological device. So, oh my gosh, the opportunity and the potential for coaching, or the space just to make sense of who am I? How do I connect with this other individual? What are some of the unsaid dynamics that we're not actually addressing? Will probably prevent or avoid some of the conflicts and the frictions that, the rest of the world has been feeling for many, many years over time.
A part of this conversation goes back to how the UK culture perhaps positions itself compared to the rest of the world. I'll say the US as the center of capitalism, perhaps. And again, big parts of Europe, Germany, France, like they have different ways of approaching issue and society and employment, of course. I would say they are kind of less entrepreneurial compared to the UK. So UK has a very particular place in the world, in my view, being kind of a certain type of an average in terms of how the social state works and how business oriented it can be. But at the same time, there are other cultural dynamics here that I have observed, especially in the last 5 years, which have to do with a certain level of skepticism that is healthy at a certain dose, but can also be a blocker after a certain while, especially when so much of entrepreneurship is about being optimistic and for no reason at all, right? And then that kind of positivity carries on, is infectious, and that's, I think, a big part of it. But the long story short, what I'm trying to get to is, in your experience, how do you think coaching and the coaches that are successful in the UK are perceived? So it's a twofold question. One is about perhaps the general receptivity of the people towards coaching in the UK versus different parts of the world. And the second part would be what persona of coaches, and this second part has especially to do with identity, I would say, are more advantageous in terms of being successful as high-level executive coaches who also make a good deal of money and who have high-level clients and are being respected, etc.
Okay, so the first question, just coming, and I just reflect on your use of the word possibilities, or as an entrepreneur, or an inventor, isn't it? We're visionary, those of us who want to create something that hasn't existed before through a startup. I think there's definitely this. My experience is that in the UK and in Britain, most of my working life has been here. However, I coach people globally from across the world. And in fact, on one day I could be coaching a very senior director in UNESCO based in Argentina. I could also be coaching someone in Sweden, a CIO in Sweden, and, another person in the Far East. So
you're the perfect person to ask this question. I'm glad I asked it.
Absolutely. No, and it's really interesting because I actually, having lived here and actually grown up, and I'm going to use the word grown up, as a professional consultant and executive coach in a very British institution, my early memories were certainly in more of that cynical mindset, not by my peers in relation to what we offered clients, or in relation to learning, or in relation to really engaging in the art of possibility. So in that way, I felt it was a wonderful, cultivating culture. But there was definitely very subtle nuances in me, my own identity as a young woman, trying to integrate into a very British institution. I just finished my master's, actually, when I joined this organization. And my group was made up of about 30 different nationalities, and I was one of a kind, if that made sense. We all belonged 100% because we were all so different, and it was probably one of the unusual moments in my life where I felt I was part of something where everyone was similar because of our differences. In this very British institution, which, by the way, I love and I have huge amounts of respect and affinity for, because that's where I grew up, it did not feel great. It felt, at times, I felt lonely. I was often on the margins. I always second guessed what I was, wanting to articulate and express and share. Now, do I speculate the cause to be bad intent or being, an exclusive culture? No. Is it a product of a dominant culture and a lot of very, very shared norms taken for granted, probably.
Yeah.
And that's just the reality. Now actually coaching a number of people globally who are international, quite a lot of Europeans, South Americans, and also Asian nationals. I'm finding far more people who've traveled, who've worked, who've had the experience I had, living as not a non-dominant culture in a dominant environment. And what I'm noticing is that dilution and that sort of, it does feel a bit weird not being part of the dominant culture and having to, and that for me has been very, very helpful. As a peer in, organizations I've worked with or in teams I've worked with, but also as an executive coach or as a professional that's offering a service.
Yeah. And on the first point, in most cases, I don't think it's intentional when people make those decisions to go with consultant A rather than consultant B, because consultant A is more in line with what is idealized from within that dominant culture, right?
Or relatable, or
exactly
familiar.
Relatable. That's also a big part of it. People don't make these decisions most of the time consciously, but that's the thing. Conscious or unconscious, the data doesn't lie. If 100 decisions are being made, and if 98 of those decisions are favoring a certain type of demographic, then we can understand, okay, we cannot blame the individuals, but then there is a common thread. There must be a common thread, right? And it becomes like the veil is lifted when you look at the numbers.
Yes.
And in your personal experience, if I can just add something of a personal note here, in my experience, I'm so happy that I've had the chance to have the experience that I did, having grown up in a different culture than the UK, seeing how people see and appreciate and perceive my potential contribution versus how it is perceived in the UK and versus how it is perceived in the US that I'm working with alongside other. This is such a productive landscape. Anyone interested in sociology to experience personally, because it's just like an A/B test, right? I'm the same person, but the reaction is different. Sometimes better, sometimes worse. And I thoroughly appreciate that. And I don't blame the people, but I do blame the culture, if that makes sense.
I love the way you describe that. Yeah. And yes, it's comforting to hear another individual who shares that. It's a sensation, isn't it? And it really resonates with me.
I mean, just to be even more blunt, in over 300, 400 startups that I have seen, understood, observed, worked as a consultant, mentor, it is incredibly rare that I see, for example, a Middle Eastern consultant executive coach for an English founder. I have never seen it. I'm sure there's an example for it, right? But I've never seen it, and not even once. So these things are perhaps skewing our perceptions in ways. And it's just like a young Black girl seeing a successful Black woman and then saying, yes, I can do it as well. So that kind of inspirational aspect, I think, is also there for different backgrounds, different types of people. And I would say the same thing for most Asian people as well. I have not seen a lot of Asian consultants. I've seen people in the workforce from all different nationalities, right? But this is my obsession about this, at the level of executive coaching. So there is almost, perhaps I'm beating a dead horse here, but just for the sake of making it absolutely clear, I think there's a feeling, an idea of, I will work with people from all cultures, but if somebody is going to tell me what to do, then I will be more selective from which cultures I will receive that from.
Yes, and one thing that might reassure you, but equally disappoint you, I, over the last few years, have built coaching faculties where we offer organizations a group of coaches that we work as a team. So obviously it's confidential, the work they do one-to-one, but then we come together for peer supervision, and then we notice some of the dynamics that are happening in the organization, some of the leadership themes that come from that show themselves through the work that we do one-to-one. Now, several organizations I've worked with have said, can you make sure that the faculty is diverse? I kid you not, it is really, really interesting. The demographic is predominantly women, predominantly white women, and in terms of the choices that I'm having to select from. actually increasingly male as well. So, but again, trying to find that diversity I've noticed myself going, oh, hang on a second, I'm having to look for it. And it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I'm having to look for it. So I think that validates a little bit of what you're saying, but equally, there are organizations deliberately, requesting that diversity.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, yeah. On the second point, is there anything you'd like to add? We've diverted quite a bit, but if you have, I think you have a good memory, so.
Oh gosh, you're putting me on the spot now. So no, the second point was more about my own experience, wasn't it? And my own experience. And well, there were two aspects to it. One is, and you've touched on it again, is, to what extent have I felt it challenging to position myself as a coach and to be selected, to be an attractive proposition for clients. But there was a second point that I can't remember. What was it? Remind me.
I remember you talked about how the culture is receptive or not.
That's right, yes. And consultants and coaches who've got a diverse background. Do you know, it's interesting. I have experienced individual specific situations, but on the whole and over time, I've had more and more openness, appreciation, curiosity about my diverse background. My coaching philosophy comes from my work and the research and all my training from Ashridge. And that's where I was born as a coach. And this philosophy, it's called relational, right? So it's the relational coaching philosophy is about connecting. And I'm hoping you've experienced it today. It's what is coming up for you right now in this relationship with this individual.
Yeah.
And look, there are times, I'm not going to lie, where I am triggered or I am thinking, oh, this person is making a judgment about me and it's making me feel really uncomfortable. Now, in those moments, I do what we talked about earlier in this conversation. And perhaps this is my Latin, because by the way, I haven't told you this, but I'm half Venezuelan and half Indian. Grew up in Venezuela, in the US. I did my university degree. And then I've lived in Europe the rest of my life. And I've married a Brit and have two kids that...
So you can basically talk about all the cultures. You have like a green light on all of them.
Yes. Well, I can sort of talk about them, but it can be very confusing at times. Now, all I was going to say is that in that relational space, as soon as I feel a judgment or a perceived judgment on my part, because that might be me not feeling like I'm being understood as I'd like to be, or it could be just a difference in values. I try to name it. I just say, look, there's something going on here and I'm not comfortable with it. And on the one hand, it could be situations where a client actually doesn't want coaching full stop or doesn't want someone, or it's been imposed upon them. And I'll say, look, what's going on here? This isn't something that I'm noticing that you want. Can we start there? Because let's stop wasting either of our time. Let's create something that's valuable for you. And that might mean me not being here. And that's not about identity and culture. It's just about two human beings.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it could be situations where I'm sure you and I might connect on this. When people make fun of either a misinterpretation that you make or misuse of language, especially here in the UK, there's quite a lot of it's a rules-driven mindset and paradigm. So if I've been a little bit over the line and then I've noticed the reaction, either it's felt to me like humiliation because I'm either told I've done it wrongly or misinterpreted. I say, well, actually, in my experience or from my perspective, this is what it looks like, and often in those moments, because I challenge them in the moment to go, oh, actually, we're different. And just because that has been the dominant rule for so long, it doesn't mean it applies to me all the time. And it certainly doesn't apply to me right now. So those are the things that help me to deal with some of those. But, when I was younger, I certainly did not have the confidence or the selfishness to use those skills.
I mean, honestly, Samreen, I feel like it's just been 5 minutes since we started talking, but it's been 40 minutes, so we have to end the podcast here now. But it's been an honest pleasure having you on and talking about these topics. For our listeners, take a look at Samreen's book, Leader Awakened. I think there are a lot of insights. If you've enjoyed this chat, I'm sure you'd enjoy the rest of the book as well. And thank you for joining in.